bring to you Dinesh D'Souza. Now, many of you know him. He is someone who has been a public defender of America, I like to say, someone who has come here to this country when he was still a teenager, come from India originally, and he has become a writer, a filmmaker, a public intellectual dealing with the things that our citizens need to know in order to ensure the survival of our country. And as you'll see by our discussion, that is no exaggeration. I am honored to welcome Dinesh D'Souza.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be on the show, and I'm looking forward to it.
You have done some incredible work, and I know a lot of our viewers are familiar with the various films that you've made. Let's do just a little quick summary of what is it, Dinesh? 5 films now that you've made?
Yes, I've got probably 20 books under my belt, but 5 documentary films. The first one was about Obama. I made that in 2012. It was called Obama's America. Then I made a film called America, Hillary's America in 2016, Death of a Nation 2018, and now this year, right now, Trump Card, the new movie that is out, not in the theater, but it's out on DVD and it's out on video on demand. You can basically get it through various platforms on a pay-per-view basis.
We, in our audience, many of them will remember, we talked at great length with our audience about both the book and the film, Death of America, especially during our recent midterm elections. And I just recently obtained and watched Trump Card. So I want to talk about these. But let me frame this discussion in terms of this question, Dinesh. I have, as a priest, been very vocal in support of President Donald Trump and the Republicans. And many people have asked me, but why are you as a priest being so political? We don't usually hear this from the clergy. And I point out something that our Catholic Church says in her official documents. The church says, look, the church advocates the kingdom of God. The church is not a political party, does not have primarily a political mission. However, although we are usually not advocates in the political arena, when the fundamental, and here I'm quoting exactly the Second Vatican Council, canon law, and other documents, when the fundamental rights of man or the freedom of the church and the salvation of souls are at stake, then we need to speak up even politically. And the argument I've been making is that this election, and not necessarily excluding some of our recent elections either, but this election is not any kind of a normal choice between, let's say, different ideas about how to get to the same goal or different plans about how to implement the same principles. We're talking about a choice between 2 very different goals and 2 very different sets of principles. And as I read and listen to what you have presented to the public, am I hearing very much the same message?
Very much so. Let me frame it this way. When Reagan ran for the presidency in 1980, he said that he was running on 5 sort of key themes. And these 5 themes will all resonate, I think, with Christians because they dovetail with the things that we consider important. So number 1, the idea of the individual, this notion that we are created equal in the eyes of God. We're individuals. 2, the idea of the family. 3, the idea of the church and the independence of the church. 4, the idea of local communities, in other words, making decisions by and large at the decentralized level. In Catholicism, it's the principle of subsidiarity. And finally, the country, patriotism, the flag, the national anthem, and so on. Now, we realize with some consternation that the socialist left today rejects all 5. They reject the idea of the uniqueness of the individual. Now that bears upon the pro-life issue, but it also bears upon the idea that they don't like this notion of the individual rising up by your bootstraps, improving your circumstances, being the architect of your own destiny. They think all that's an illusion. 2, they don't like the family. It's too patriarchal, it's oppressive. 3, They don't like the church. They will impose differential restrictions on the church that they won't impose, for example, on a political protest. 4, they don't like local self-government. And 5, they don't like the national anthem. They don't like the flag. They're rewriting the history of the country to make it one series of uninterrupted crimes against minorities. So you see here how you can almost call it the common fabric of American life, the kind of moral grounding of our national experience, at least as Reagan summarized it, as I identify with it as an immigrant. This is being flatly rejected by really an alien philosophy that's failed all over the world. It's the most discredited idea since slavery. And yet, wow, here it is back in the mainstream of American politics. And that's what's on the ballot in November.
You know, in Death of a Nation, you took a very historical approach looking at the Democrat Party and its origins and in where it got so many of its ideas and policies. And in Trump Card, you're really taking a look at the present and this current battle that is going on and the forces that President Trump has had to deal with over these last almost 4 years. Tell us, where does this, you outlined this wholesale rejection of fundamental principles on which we stand. Where does this reside today? You mentioned leftists and socialism. What's the relationship between that and the Democrat Party that people are going to see on the ballot?
The Democratic Party is a progressive party, and progressivism is an ideology that developed in the early part. Well, it goes back to the late 19th century, but in the early 20th century, you had 3 philosophies that came to the forefront, and they were sort of cousins. So socialism, fascism, progressivism. All these philosophies are on the left side of the aisle, by which I mean they're opposed to the free market. They are philosophies of the strong centralized state. And even though the Democrats have been progressive now for almost 100 years, they've rejected explicit socialism. In that sense, Bernie Sanders is a kind of an outlier. But the Democrats have moved more in the direction of socialism than ever before. The socialist influence is greater now than at any time in the party's history. And you get the feeling that with the Joe Biden, he's sitting in a canoe, but the socialists they're in charge of the oars. They're the ones steering the boat. Biden is a kind of traveler in the canoe, but he's not directing the canoe. So socialism here, by socialism, what we're talking about is a philosophy of centralized government, but it's a great mistake to think of socialism purely in terms of economic confiscation. That it is true that Marx focused on the economic dimension of socialism, a class divide between the rich and the poor. But for today's socialists, they care more about abortion than the minimum wage. They care more about the transgender bathroom than they do about universal basic income. So there's a cultural Marxism that runs alongside the economic socialism, and both are treated extensively in the movie Trump Card.
Yes, and brothers and sisters, for those of you that are just joining us, we are honored today to be joined by Dinesh D'Souza, author, filmmaker, public scholar, defender of America and our values, and he recently released, really just earlier this month, Trump Card, a film we want to urge you to watch before you cast your vote in this election. So tell us, Dinesh, a little bit more about this. Trump Card, what is the main message that it conveys?
Well, the title, of course, I picked only because Trump is the dominant figure in this election. Even the people voting for Biden are kind of voting against Trump. So it reminds me of the line from Julius Caesar, he stands astride the world like a colossus, and that's Trump. He sets the terms of the debate. Now, that being said, the main theme of the movie is socialism, and how an idea that was tried in 25 countries in the last century collapsed everywhere. All the big countries, Russia, China, India, abandoned socialism. How can an idea that is the most discredited idea since slavery, how can it make a comeback and find itself now in the mainstream of American politics an appealing doctrine to a lot of young people and shaping the course of the Democratic Party. So the movie looks at how we got here, who's behind this socialism, why it's evil, and finally how we can stop it.
Now, of course, this has connections, doesn't it, very much with your personal life, because you, as we mentioned earlier, are originally from India, and your wife, isn't she from Venezuela?
Yes, Debbie, my wife, and I have both experienced socialism, not exactly in the same way, because India was a very poor country when it got independence in 1947. But the Indian leaders had studied in England and they picked up this Fabian socialism from the British. You can almost say socialism was the last export of colonialism. And so they introduced it to India for 40 years. It was a horrific failure. I remember growing up, my family had a ration card which said you could only buy so much rice and so much sugar and so much cooking oil. We were on a 7-year waiting list to get a phone. So socialism to me is symbolized by scarcity, by misery. India was sort of the begging bowl of the world. Now, interestingly for Debbie, when she grew up in Venezuela, in the late 60s and early 70s, Venezuela was a very prosperous country. It was a capitalist country. It had a multi-party system. And Hugo Chavez, the socialist, was not elected until the late 1990s. And he was a very patient man. He waited 7 years before starting the Socialist Party of Venezuela. But over the past 20 years, this oil-rich, successful country has been reduced to rubble by socialism. Now, India is doing better today, but that's because the Indians have moved away from socialism. So, yes, we've got a lot of experience with socialism in our family. We are not fans of it because we know what it does and we know what it'll do to America.
So what are some of the signs that we're moving in that direction, or at least the Democratic Party has been infected by this? I know one of the things that struck me in the movie was, we hear these Democrat candidates talking about the gun violence and gun control and whatnot, and you brought out the point about how that was one of the first things done in Venezuela to institute this new kind of regime. Tell us the connection on that issue and some of the other issues that the Democrat Party is embracing that would tell us that we're moving in the wrong direction.
Well, the leftists who are champions of socialism like to say that they are following the model of Scandinavia, and they're not following the model of Venezuela. But the truth of it is they're following the Venezuelan model, and this is very clear when you look at their actions. So, for example, they do not knock down Columbus statues in Scandinavia, but they do in Venezuela, and the left does that in America. They don't demonize the rich in Scandinavia, but they do and did in Venezuela, driving many entrepreneurs out of the country. And of course, the rhetoric of people like Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, if you take away their demonization of the rich, you would render them completely mute. That's all they say. That's all they do. Third, gun confiscation. In Venezuela, they confiscated the guns, and the moment the citizens were vulnerable, they unleashed a reign of terror against them. Here, too, there's a talk of confiscating guns. Antifa. There's no Antifa in Scandinavia, but Venezuela has its own version of Antifa. It's called the Colectivos. Essentially, it's a group of criminals who have been released by the socialist state to do what? To go terrorize small business, to do arson, to beat up on political dissidents. So the exact kind of street thuggery that Antifa and Black Lives Matter are doing in this country, they have their equivalent in Venezuela. And finally, the Chavistas, socialist class, lives high on the hog. When Hugo Chavez died, he was a billionaire. Again, in Scandinavia, you won't find a politician ever who has gone from 0 to 100 million euros on a government salary. Never happens. But it's happened here with the Clintons. It's happened with Al Gore. We now know about the Biden scandal. Biden is basically, the Biden scandal isn't about Hunter Biden. It's about Joe Biden using his family members, including his son-in-law, as bagmen. They go with him on these foreign trips. They make side deals with government officials. And when they all get home, they put all the money on the ground and they all take their share of the loot, just like a typical mafia family. And Joe Biden is the ringleader of it. And it's now come out, and the media may try to suppress it, but I think the cat is out of the bag.
Yeah, that's for sure. Well, for those that are just joining us, friends, we're with Dinesh D'Souza, creator of this movie, Trump Card, which Dinesh, before we go further into the substance of this, how can people get hold of this and watch it before Election Day?
Trump Card, unlike my other films, is not in the theater. It's on demand. TrumpCardTheMovie.com is the website. The good news is it just went up on Amazon Prime. It's available through Apple iTunes, through Google, through YouTube, Vudu, some of the cable platforms, Xfinity, Comcast. So there are many different platforms. You can watch it on any device, your phone, your tablet, I prefer you watch it on your big screen TV because it was made actually for the big screen. So it's a movie with that kind of reach and power. And so I would say go to your big screen TVs, pick out Apple iTunes or pick out Amazon Prime, search for the movie Trump Card, and boom, you can watch it right there tonight.
And I'll say to our friends that are watching, when you sit down to watch this, be ready to be like a sponge, okay, that is going to be put under a waterfall because the information, the insights, Dinesh, the interviews, the style of this is very fascinating because you're making your points, you're developing your points, but then you're going from one fascinating interview to the next with all these different people. And before we get into some of those specific interviews, I want to touch on a very touching moment. I think it's at the beginning of the movie, if I recall, when you're getting a phone call from President Donald Trump. This first of all, I've been talking about the fact that, this is really a man who connects with the people. He is a man of tremendous character, kindness, generosity, and strength. And you've experienced that personally, haven't you? Bring us to that moment and tell us a little bit about, your own personal connection with Donald Trump.
Well, I had been targeted by the Obama administration for prosecution for the heinous crime of giving $20,000 of my own money to a college friend of mine who was running for the Senate in New York. I did exceed the campaign finance law, but typically this is met with a warning or a fine. Recently, the FEC sent a letter to the Biden campaign listing 200 pages of donors who had exceeded the campaign finance limit. There was no talk of either indicting them or prosecuting them or putting 10 FBI agents on them. The idea was maybe you just want to return the excess money, and that's the end of the story. So that's how this is normally handled. But in my case, I was severely prosecuted. I was locked up overnight in a federal confinement center for 8 months. I had mandatory psychiatric counseling, all kinds of stuff. I had to pay a big fine. The whole thing cost me $500,000. So the bottom line of it is I would have been a lifelong felon at the end of it, except that I got a pardon from the president. And what I think was very striking is that when Trump called on the phone, I'd never met him. He didn't owe me a pardon. He didn't know me. He wasn't paying off a favor of any kind. He just goes, I knew your case was BS. And he said the word, and I was like, wow. But he was like, I knew it was fake. It was bogus, and I'm in a position to fix it. And so, hey, I'm going to give you a pardon in the morning. End of story. And the beauty of this is that any other Republican would have been like, let me call my advisors together. Is this strategically a prudent thing to do? What is the left going to say? What will the headline in the New York Times be tomorrow? Well, let's have a focus group on this. No, for Trump, it was a gut issue of a wrong has been done. I happen to be in a position to fix it, and I'm going to do it.
Yes, and that's a pattern that comes across so regularly with him. I love to listen to the stories that he tells, sometimes others are telling, where he'll just connect with people. He'll listen to people. He says, look, I consider you, in talking to the public, I consider you to be the elite. We're the elite. This is not just a campaign. This is a movement. And then, of course, as you know, and this started after Trump Card was released, this phenomenon, I'd really love your insight into this phenomenon of the people at his rallies chanting, "We love you." Now, I don't think we've ever heard this in American politics. 4 more years, yes, but "we love you." And I think it's a direct result of the fact that he loves us. He fights for the American people, and he connects in that human way, the same way he connected with you and dealt with your issue. He does this for all of us, and he fights for us and for what we stand for. What have your thoughts been as this "We Love You" chant has been emerging at these rallies?
I think it shows how interesting it is that you've got this guy who has lived this kind of rarefied life and is a billionaire, and yet he's unlike any other billionaire that I know. Now, Debbie and I know about a dozen of them, and they're a varied group. But the bottom line of it is none of them are like Trump, and the truth of it is none of them even understand Trump. They have a little bit in general of a disdain for Trump because they feel like he's a little bit of a plebeian. He's a little bit of a sort of rough cut billionaire. He doesn't really have taste. He doesn't really have class. But another way to put it is that none of those guys could identify with an ordinary guy who's driving a truck. None of those guys would have anything to say to a doorman who opened a door for them at a hotel. But I have a feeling that Trump himself in his early days was a doorman. And he did stuff like that. And he learned from the bottom up, kind of the way that a great chef learns to be a busboy and then learns how to just, cut onions. And so Trump has been through it. And so he's got that common touch that makes him very exceptional as a member of the sort of billionaire class. And I think that is really the key to his political accessibility, the fact that the ordinary guy feels that they could approach Trump and they could have a normal conversation with him.
And getting back then to the substance of Trump card, you talked about, this socialist dynamic is about the centrality of the state, concentration of power and control there. You brought up the same thing, of course, in Death of a Nation. I found it very striking when you were comparing the Democrat platform and their policies with those of the Nazi Party, and a lot of times people will, they'll hear this kind of language and they'll say, "Oh, this is an exaggeration. This is extreme." But this is where Donald Trump is the nightmare for the left, isn't he? I mean, he just stands right in the way of this kind of dynamic. I mean, he's stopping it. He's reversing it. Tell us more about that.
Well, I think that Trump has a bit of a secret weapon, and that is having come out of American popular culture with his background as an author, with The Apprentice. He's someone who's lived in pop culture. And he knows rappers. He's promoted boxing events. He's promoted mixed martial arts. So this is a guy who has sort of has one foot deeply in American popular culture. And that gives him a big advantage over the typical Republican politician for whom pop culture is really something quite alien, quite remote. Trump also fights both in the political battlefield and on the cultural battlefield. That too is a big change. He recognizes the political battlefield as being only one corner of a kind of larger arena. Trump has had to face the phenomenon of the deep state. And by this, I mean the police agencies of government, which have become corrupted at the top. This is something that happened under the Clintons and under Obama. Reagan never had to face this. Reagan wouldn't have to dream that the FBI was somehow conspiring to deny him re-election or to do illegal surveillance on him. So this is why I think Reagan would be a fish out of water in today's America. But Lincoln wouldn't, because the waters were even more roiled when Lincoln came to Washington. So the bottom line of it is Trump, I think, has shown us how to fight. He's shown Republicans that we have to be tough. He's also shown us that when we are just the party of the nice guys and we're passive, the left will take advantage of us. They knock down our monuments and they believe we will never knock down their monuments. They threaten to pack the court in the full confidence that we would never dream of doing the same. They deploy the deep state against us thinking, well, wow, even if those guys control the government, they would never use the deep state against us. So all of these questions are now forced upon us, which is to say, if we don't do to them what they are doing to us, how do we make them stop?
You mentioned Lincoln, and when we watch this movie, it's put in the context of seeing Lincoln on a train throughout. Tell us go a little deeper for us into the connection with Abraham Lincoln and what Donald Trump is facing.
Well, let's think for a moment about Lincoln and what set off the Civil War. Because people go, well, the Civil War, was it really about slavery or was it really about something else? Well, one thing it was undeniably about is this. A Republican, really the first Republican, was elected president legitimately and got an electoral majority. And the Democrats went berserk. They refused to accept the result. They would rather break up the country than endure the prospect of a Republican presidency. Well, think of the chilling similarity between that and Trump's election in 2016. A Republican elected, close election, but no one denies a legitimate election. The Democrats to this day have not really fully come to terms with the result. And they have been deploying, as in their own words, any means necessary to try to capsize this presidency. Lincoln, in 1863, the Union Army for the first time began to deploy black soldiers. And the Confederates were so outraged that they issued an edict that any black soldier captured by the Confederacy would be shot. Not white soldiers who were normal prisoners of war. And now we showed the scene in the movie. When it came to Lincoln's attention, he signed what is called by historians the Order of Retaliation. An Order of Retaliation. And Lincoln basically said this: for every black Union soldier executed by the Confederacy, one Confederate captive will be shot. Now, again, why would a moderate man do something that is so extreme? And the answer is simple. Lincoln knew that if you don't do to them what they're doing to you, they won't stop. And in fact, when Lincoln issued the order, the Confederates did stop. They stopped the practice and Lincoln withdrew the executive order. So you see here, I think this is to me a metaphor for our situation, which is to say that we have to hold these guys accountable. If you don't hold the deep state accountable, it will continue its shenanigans. If an Antifa guy breaks a window and nobody arrests him, he'll break every window in the neighborhood. They interpret our passivity as a measure of their success.
Mm-hmm. You know, you had some fascinating interviews in this movie. What were one or two of the ones that impressed or surprised you the most, and what do we take away from them?
Well, since you watched the movie, you know that there's a certain kind of fearlessness that characterizes it. In two areas where I decided to go, where most people probably wouldn't, is one, there's an interview in which I interview a guy named Larry Sinclair talking about his allegations of sexual involvement with Barack Obama. In other words, that he was a gay prostitute, in effect, who was used by Barack Obama on more than one occasion. Now, the reason I did this was I wanted to look at the issue of the media and the way the media covers really uncorroborated allegations against Trump. You just have to say it, and you're in 60 Minutes. Look at Stormy Daniels. She's everywhere. Well, what about this guy, Larry Sinclair? He had a press conference, but he was never covered. The allegation wasn't even mentioned in the New York Times or the Washington Post, never mentioned on NPR, never mentioned on CNN or CBS or ABC. A media blackout, very similar to the blackout we're seeing now with regard to the Biden computer scandal, the corruption scandal. So these people aren't real journalists. That's my point. It's not even that they're biased. They have press badges, but they're not real reporters at all. They're sort of like lobbyists, or they're like paid operatives of the Democratic National Committee. You know, if someone said a paid operative of the Democratic National Committee says X, I'm not even interested in listening. I don't give any weight to that at all. So we have to learn to reduce the power of the mainstream media in our own mind. A second theme in the movie, the intervention of radical Islam in our politics. That's not something that's been in the news. We hear all this talk about Russia collusion, you know, and what it amounts to is 4 Russians who bought a Facebook ad for $5,000. It's just stupid. But the truth of it is radical Islamic regimes. I'm not talking about Muslims organizing politically. I'm talking about regimes like Iran using intermediaries like Qatar to pump money into American think tanks, pay American journalists, use the money to support socialist candidates like Ilhan Omar. So we go into this in the movie, and it's a sort of a frightening sidelight of the movie, the way in which permissive, the secular left, which is very permissive, is somehow weirdly allied with radical Islam.
Well, Dinesh D'Souza, we have only scratched the surface of this tremendous work that you've given us. I really want to urge as strongly as I can, our viewers, obtain and watch as soon as you can Trump Card. It is a marvelous preparation for this election. And Dinesh, once again, how can they get hold of it?
TrumpCardTheMovie.com. If you want to get it right off your TV, go to Amazon Prime or Apple iTunes. It's on YouTube. It's on Google. It's a whole bunch of places, and you can order a physical DVD from Walmart.com or Target.com.
And Death of a Nation, of course, is still available as well, right? Where would people get that? That's both the book and the movie.
Yes, absolutely. All my movies are out there and available, and they form a sort of tapestry. So I would recommend starting with the latest one, Trump Card, because it's right about what's going on right now in the headlines. But then you can weave your way all the way back to the Obama movie, which is interesting to watch now. I sort of made a prediction about what Obama will turn out to be, and you can judge for yourself whether this was accurate or not.
Fantastic. Well, I want to thank you on behalf of countless people, not the least of whom are among our faithful viewers here at Priests for Life, for all the work that you've done, the suffering you've endured, the courage that you've shown, the love for America that you've demonstrated, and the motivation that you've given us to work hard for our country and for this president. Thank you. I look forward to connecting with you again and frequently, I hope, and let's labor together until we have the victory. Thank you, Dinesh D'Souza.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.